You are walking through the damp, gas-lit streets of Paris in the late autumn of 1940, and the first thing you notice is the silence. It is not the peaceful silence of a city settling into sleep, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of a place holding its breath. The cobblestones beneath your boots are slick with a thin layer of cold rain, reflecting the faint, blue-tinted glow of the blackout lamps. Everywhere you look, the shadows seem to stretch longer, twisting around the corners of limestone buildings that have stood for centuries. The air smells of wet stone, cheap tobacco, and a faint metallic tang of exhaust from the military vehicles parked along the boulevards. Paris, the city of light, has been plunged into a perpetual twilight, its soul locked away behind shuttered windows and heavy velvet drapes. As you step into the deeper darkness of an alleyway, you hear the rhythmic, synchronized thud of leather jack boots echoing on a nearby avenue. It is a sound that has become the heartbeat of occupied Europe, steady, mechanical, and entirely devoid of mercy. To most people walking these streets, that sound brings a cold knot of dread to the stomach, a reminder that a single wrong look, a forgotten identity paper, or a momentary hesitation could mean a one-way trip to a windowless basement in the Rue des Saussets. The Gestapo has woven a web across the city, a network of informants, wiretaps, and watchers who trade human lives for extra butter rations or immunity. They believe they own the night. They believe they have cataloged every threat, measured every enemy, and broken the spirit of anyone who dared to stand against them. But they are wrong. If you look closely through the gloom, past the patrolling soldiers and the shivering civilians queuing for stale bread, you might catch a glimpse of a woman stepping out from the side door of a nondescript cafe. She wears a well-tailored wool coat, her dark hair pinned back in the elegant style of the day, a subtle trail of expensive perfume lingering in her wake. To the German officers who tip their hats to her as she passes, she is just another wealthy, harmless socialite navigating the inconveniences of war. They see her bright lipstick, her confident stride, and her easy, charming smile, and they assume she belongs to their world of luxury and complacency. They do not see the microfilmed list of downed British airmen sewn into the lining of her satin brassiere. They do not notice the slight, calculated tension in her jaw as she mentally maps the patrol routes of the local guards. This is Nancy Wake. To the bureaucratic monsters of the Third Reich, she is a ghost, an irritating friction in their perfect machine, an elusive phantom. They have given a name that drips with frustrated contempt: the White Mouse. The men hunting her are not fools. They are highly trained, clinical psychologists of state terror. They have file cabinets filled with descriptions, grainy photographs of suspects, and psychological profiles of resistance leaders. Yet, for months, this one entity has slipped through their fingers like water. They look for a saboteur, and they look for a man. Someone with dirt under his fingernails, a desperate look in his eyes, and a coat smelling of cordite. They do not look for the elegant woman drinking champagne at the Ritz, laughing just a little too loudly at a German colonel's mediocre joke. They do not understand that her femininity is not a weakness, but a flawless, impenetrable armor. She has turned their own arrogance into her greatest blind spot. Imagine the immense psychological weight of living every second within that blind spot. Every time Nancy steps out of her apartment, she is stepping onto a high wire stretched over an abyss. There is no safety net, no government agency that can rescue her if her foot slips, if she makes a single mistake, if she speaks a word of French with the slight, unmistakable lilt of her native antipodes, if she hesitates for a fraction of a second when a guard asks for her papers, if she shows even a flicker of pity when she witnesses an arrest on the street, the trap will snap shut. The Gestapo does not just execute people like her, they break them. They use the slow, methodical application of pain in dark rooms to extract names, addresses, and codes, turning heroes into instruments of betrayal before ending their lives. Nancy knows this. She has seen the posters on the walls, listing the names of those shot for treason against the occupying forces. She has heard the rumors of what happens behind the closed doors of the secret police headquarters. And yet, as she walks through the mist tonight, her pulse remains steady. There is a strange, cold clarity that settles over a person when they accept that their life is no longer entirely their own. She is not fighting for glory, nor is she driven by a textbook sense of patriotism for a country she wasn't even born in. She is driven by a deep, burning fury at the sheer ugliness of the occupation, the way it degrades human dignity, the way it forces good people to look at the ground and whisper. The silence of Paris is broken momentarily by the distant, mournful wail of a train whistle from the Gare du Nord. That train might be carrying supplies to the Eastern Front, or it might be carrying human cargo toward a destination from which no one returns. For Nancy, that sound is a ticking clock. Every hour she remains free is an hour she can use to disrupt the machinery of hate. She is a smuggler of human lives, a courier of secrets, a financial lifeline for a fragile underground network that is currently the only thing standing between total despair and a spark of hope. The Gestapo has recently increased the price on her head to 5 million francs. It is a fortune, enough money to make a saint consider betrayal and a desperate man commit murder. Her face, or at least a vague approximation of it, drawn from the frantic descriptions of frustrated border guards, is etched into the minds of every detective from Paris to the Pyrenees. They are looking for a mouse, expecting something small, frightened, and scurrying in the dark. They have no idea that the woman they are hunting possesses the tactical mind of a general, the cold nerve of an assassin, and a heart that refuses to be terrified. As the night deepens and the cold fog rolls in from the Seine, swallowing the monuments and the ministries, the story of the White Mouse begins not with a grand explosion or a dramatic declaration of war, but with a quiet step into the shadows and a door closing softly in the dark. You are looking at a map of the world, tracing your finger far away from the blood-soaked soil of 20th century Europe down to the bottom of the globe, where the Pacific Ocean meets the rugged coastlines of New Zealand. It is here, in a modest suburb of Wellington in the winter of 1912, that Nancy Wake enters a world that she would spend her entire life shaking to its core. There are no signs of the warrior she would become, no grand omens, just a youngest child born into a family that was already beginning to fray at the edges. When you look into her earliest years, you see a landscape of instability. Her father, a charismatic but deeply erratic journalist, uproots the family and moves them across the Tasman Sea to Sydney, Australia. When Nancy is just a toddler, not long after, he walks out on them entirely, returning to New Zealand under the guise of filming a documentary, never to return. He leaves her mother alone to raise 6 children in a rented house with very little money and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. This is the first wound, the formative silence that fills the halls of her childhood home. Her mother, crushed by the weight of her responsibilities, turns toward a rigid, suffocating religious orthodoxy. For a high-spirited, fiercely independent girl like Nancy, that house does not feel like a sanctuary. It feels like a cage. You can trace her legendary defiance back to these quiet domestic skirmishes. Nancy is not a child who obeys simply because an adult tells her to. When she is locked in her room for rebellion, she doesn't cry. She plans her escape. When she is told how a proper young lady should look, speak, and think, she deliberately does the opposite. She learns early that if you do not control your own life, someone else will gladly write your script for you. She possesses a wild, untamed energy that scares her mother and baffles her siblings. She runs through the sun-baked streets of Sydney with a fierce, burning curiosity about the world beyond the horizon. She doesn't want a quiet life of domestic predictability. She wants the world. By the time she is 16, the cage can no longer hold her. She runs away from home, taking a job as a nurse at a mental asylum. It is a brutal, eye-opening introduction to the rawest realities of human suffering and psychological fracture. For a teenager, it is a baptism by fire. She does not flinch from the madness or the darkness. Instead, she develops a profound, unshakable emotional resilience. She learns to look directly at chaos without losing her footing. It is also during this time that a stroke of unexpected fortune changes her destiny forever. An eccentric aunt passes away, leaving Nancy a legacy of £200 in 1932. That is not just money. It is a golden ticket to freedom. It is the price of a ticket on a ship bound for London. You can imagine her standing on the deck of that ocean liner, watching the harbor bridge of Sydney fade into the distance, her heart pounding with the exhilarating, terrifying knowledge that she is completely alone. She is 20 years old, with a pocket full of cash, an insatiable appetite for life, and absolutely no intention of ever looking back. When she arrives in Europe, she doesn't head for the museums or the tea rooms. She plunges headfirst into the bohemian, fast-paced world of journalism. She studies at a commercial college in London, convinces a major newspaper group that she can write, and finds herself stationed in Paris as a European correspondent. This is the version of Nancy she had always envisioned. Independent, glamorous, drinking in the cafes of Montparnasse, smoking fine cigarettes, and trading witty barbs with intellectuals and artists. She is a master of reinventing herself. She adopts the latest French fashions, refines her wit, and develops a taste for expensive champagne and high society. She learns how to move through wealthy circles with absolute ease, a skill that will later become a matter of life and death. But the 1930s are not a time for innocent indulgence. As a journalist, Nancy has a front-row seat to the slow, sickening rot of old Europe. She watches as the fragile peace forged after the Great War begins to splinter. She travels across the continent, reporting on the rising tides of nationalism and political violence. And then, in 1933, her assignments take her to Berlin. You are standing beside her now in a city draped in massive blood-red banners bearing the swastika. The atmosphere is thick with a strange, intoxicating hysteria. She witnesses the torch-lit parades, the synchronized chanting of thousands of men in brown shirts, and the terrifying charisma of a new dictator who promises national resurrection through hatred. To many foreign observers at the time, it is a bizarre but perhaps temporary political circus. To Nancy, it is an immediate, visceral horror. Her journalistic instincts allow her to see past the pageantry straight into the dark soul of the movement. The definitive turning point of her life, the psychological wound that transforms her from an observer into a fighter, occurs on a street corner in Vienna. While on an assignment, she comes across a public square where a crowd has gathered. She pushes her way to the front and freezes. A group of Nazi thugs has forced a collection of elderly Jewish men and women onto their knees. They have given them scrubbing brushes and buckets of lye, forcing them to clean the political slogans off the pavement, while the onlookers laugh, jeer, and spit on them. Nancy watches as an old man, his hands bleeding from the caustic chemicals, collapses from exhaustion only to be brutally kicked by a young stormtrooper whose face is twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated cruelty. Something snaps inside Nancy Wake at that moment. The veneer of journalistic detachment evaporates, replaced by a cold, blinding fury. She does not see a political movement. She sees a fundamental violation of human decency. She looks at the faces of the perpetrators and the cowardly indifference of the crowd, and she makes a silent, solemn vow to herself. She promises that if she ever has the opportunity, if she ever finds a way to strike back against this monstrous regime, she will take it, no matter the cost. She realizes that neutrality in the face of absolute evil is itself a form of collaboration. She returns to France with a heavy heart, but a clear vision. The carefree days of her youth are over. The shadow is lengthening across the continent. Yet, before the storm breaks completely, life offers her a brief, beautiful interlude of profound happiness. In 1936, while visiting Marseille, she meets Henri Fiocca. Henri is everything Nancy is not. Wealthy, deeply cultured, a sophisticated industrialist from a prominent French family, and a man of quiet, gentle dignity, he is also utterly, helplessly captivated by this wild, outspoken Anglo-Saxon woman who drinks him under the table and speaks her mind without apology. They fall deeply, passionately in love. Henri does not try to tame her. He adores her fierce independence. They marry in the summer of 1939, purchasing a luxury apartment overlooking the harbor of Marseille. For a moment, Nancy is surrounded by everything she could ever want: a devoted husband, immense wealth, a beautiful home, and a life of absolute comfort. But history is a cruel landlord. Just months after their wedding, the air raid sirens begin to wail across France. The phony war is over. The German war machine unleashes its blitzkrieg, and within weeks, the French armies collapse, and the swastika is hoisted over the Eiffel Tower. The southern coast, where Nancy lives, falls under the collaborationist Vichy regime, a puppet state that wears a French uniform but carries out the orders of Berlin. You can see Nancy standing on the balcony of her luxurious home, looking out at the beautiful Mediterranean Sea, knowing that the moment she promised herself in Vienna has finally arrived. She has wealth, she has status, and as the wife of a prominent businessman, she could easily sit out the war in relative safety and luxury. She could look away, just as millions of others are doing. Instead, she turns to her husband and tells him that she cannot remain idle. Henri, knowing the immense danger, looking into the eyes of the woman he loves more than life itself, does not try to stop her. He opens his checkbook, offers his resources, and joins her in the shadows. The socialite of Marseille is about to die, and the white mouse is about to be born. You are standing on a remote, rocky track high in the Pyrenees Mountains, where the wind howls through the jagged peaks, and the air is so cold it burns your lungs. It is late 1941. Below you, the vast occupied continent of Europe lies trapped under a shroud of tyranny. But here, along these treacherous, hidden paths that connect France to neutral Spain, a fragile artery of freedom exists. And at the center of this secret network is a wealthy woman from Marseille, driving a high-powered ambulance, navigating military checkpoints, with a trunk full of contraband and a smile that can disarm a suspicious border guard. When Nancy Wake chose to fight, she did not start with minor acts of defiance. She understood that the most urgent need for the Allied cause was the preservation of human intelligence. British airmen were being shot down over occupied territory every week. Soldiers were stranded after the disaster at Dunkirk, and political refugees were being hunted by the secret police. If these people could be smuggled out of France, they could fight again. Nancy uses her husband, Henri's immense fortune, to purchase a luxury ambulance, convincing the Vichy authorities that she is a wealthy humanitarian dedicated to relieving the suffering of wounded soldiers. It is a brilliant, audacious cover story. Imagine the psychological chess match she must play every single day. You are sitting in the passenger seat beside her as she approaches a roadblock manned by heavily armed soldiers. The air inside the vehicle is tense, thick with the scent of her expensive perfume and the underlying tang of sweat. Underneath the false floorboards of the vehicle lie three bruised, terrified Royal Air Force pilots who do not speak a word of French. If they cough, if they shift their weight, or if a guard decides to perform a thorough search, the game is over. As the soldier approaches, his hand resting on the holster of his pistol, Nancy does not panic. She doesn't offer a trembling ID card. Instead, she leans out the window, bats her eyelashes, flashes a dazzling socialite smile, and unleashes a torrent of high-class, flirtatious French. She treats the checkpoint not as a life-or-death barrier, but as a tedious interruption to her social calendar. She complains about the quality of wartime cosmetics, teases the young officer about his posture, and slips him a packet of rare, black-market English cigarettes. She plays the part of the wealthy, vapid industrialist's wife so perfectly that the soldier feels foolish for even questioning her. He waves her through with a grin and a tip of his cap. The moment the checkpoint fades into the rearview mirror, her smile vanishes, replaced by a cold, calculating look of absolute focus. Her pulse hasn't even quickened. For over 2 years, this becomes the rhythm of her life. She transforms her luxury apartment in Marseille into a safe house, a sanctuary where hunted men can wash the grease of coal cars from their skin, eat a hot meal, and receive forged identity papers before being guided into the mountains. She becomes an expert in the art of forgery, studying the exact placement of German rubber stamps and the precise grain of official paper. She coordinates with local guides, black marketeers, and corrupt officials, spending hundreds of thousands of francs to grease the wheels of her escape network. But the shadows are growing more crowded. The Gestapo, frustrated by the systematic leakage of high-value Allied personnel from the south of France, assigns its most ruthless agents to plug the gap. They realize there is a singular, elusive entity orchestrating the escapes, someone who moves between the social elite and the criminal underworld with impossible ease. They do not know her name, her nationality, or what she looks like, but they note her ability to vanish the moment they draw near. They begin to refer to her in their internal memos as Die Weiße Maus, the white mouse. The psychological pressure. By early 1943, the net begins to tear. A double agent inside the network cracks under Gestapo interrogation, giving up names and descriptions. The safe houses are raided one by one. Nancy receives a frantic coded message. The secret police know who she is. Her real name is now tied to the moniker of the White Mouse. The price on her head skyrockets to 5 million francs. Posters with a rough sketch of her features are pasted inside railway stations and police barracks across the country. She can no longer return to her luxury apartment. She can no longer sleep in a bed. The hunter has become the hunted. Nancy is forced to flee Marseille, leaving behind her wealth, her comfort, and most agonizingly, her husband. Henri insists on staying behind to manage their assets and maintain the illusion that she has simply run away after a domestic dispute. Their parting is swift, quiet, and heartbreaking. They both know the risks, yet they choose the mission over their own safety. Her escape from France is an epic of sheer survival. You are tracking her movements as she flees northward, attempting to cross into Spain. She is arrested by the Vichy police at a railway station, but she manages to lie her way out of custody by claiming to be the mistress of a high-ranking official, leveraging her sophisticated accent to terrify the local gendarmes into releasing her. She is forced to jump from a moving train under a hail of gunfire to avoid a Gestapo identity check. She hides in thickets, crawls through drainage ditches, and walks for miles through the biting mountain cold until she finally crosses the Pyrenees into Spain, her boots worn down to the bloodied soles of her feet. When she arrives in London in the summer of 1943, she is exhausted, penniless, and deeply traumatized by the loss of her life in France. But she does not ask for a quiet desk job or a comfortable exile. Instead, she walks straight into the headquarters of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, Winston Churchill's secret ministry of ungentlemanly warfare. She tells them she wants to go back. The British officers look at this elegant, fierce woman and realize they have found something extraordinary. They accept her into their elite training program. For months, Nancy undergoes a grueling transformation. She is trained in silent killing, martial arts, demolition, wireless telegraphy, and parachute jumps. She learns how to kill a man with her bare hands in the dark, how to plant plastic explosives on a railway line, and how to lead men in battle. She excels in every discipline, out-drinking, out-shooting, and out-marching her male counterparts. She is no longer just a smuggler. She has been forged into a weapon of war. In April 1944, as the Allies prepare for the massive invasion of Normandy, Nancy Wake steps into the belly of a blacked-out bomber aircraft. She wears a heavy canvas jumpsuit, a parachute strapped to her back, and a capsule of cyanide hidden in her pocket in case of capture. She is being dropped back into the heart of darkness, the Auvergne region of central France, to organize the chaotic, fractured guerrilla armies of the French resistance into a lethal fighting force. As the green light flashes above the jump door and she leaps out into the midnight air, her ascent is complete. The socialite has vanished entirely. The elite operative has taken her place. You are hanging suspended in a vast ink-black sky, feeling the tremendous, icy rush of the midnight wind tearing at your canvas jumpsuit as you drift down toward the jagged, pine-covered peaks of the Auvergne region in central France. It is April 1944. Below you, the ancient volcanic landscape of the Massif Central looks like a crumpled velvet blanket, dark, silent, and treacherous. As the silken canopy of your parachute snaps open with a violent crack that reverberates through your teeth, you look down into the abyss of an occupied nation. You are entirely alone. There are no friendly armies waiting on the ground, no supply lines, and no safety zones. There is only a wilderness filled with thousands of heavily armed German troops, a desperate population, and a fractured resistance movement hidden in the hills. This is the moment Nancy Wake steps back onto the soil of the country she has sworn to defend, not as a wealthy fugitive escaping through the back door, but as a heavily armed commander dropping from the clouds to ignite a revolution. When her boots hit the damp earth, plunging her into a thick briar patch, she does not stop to catch her breath or admire the stars. Her parachute has caught in the upper branches of a tree, swaying gently in the night breeze like a ghostly white sheet. Out of the darkness, the rough, suspicious hands of the Maquis, the French guerrilla fighters, pull her down. Their leader, a rugged, battle-hardened partisan named Henri Tardivat, looks at this elegant woman, smoothing her hair, adjusting her pistol belt, and brushing the dirt from her trousers. He smirks, trying to assert his dominance over this foreign intruder sent by London. He looks at her parachute, swinging from the branches, and remarks with typical French sarcasm, "I hope all the trees in France bear such beautiful fruit this spring." Nancy does not blink. She looks him dead in the eye, her voice cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of fear, and replies, "Don't give me that academic crap. Let's get to work." In that single sharp exchange, the psychological dynamic of the entire region shifts. Nancy understands the immense, isolating weight of the crown she is wearing. She has been sent by the Special Operations Executive to command, fund, and supply over 7,000 disparate, unruly, and deeply suspicious male guerrilla fighters hidden in the mountains. These are men who have fled the cities to escape forced labor, men who are hungry, angry, and deeply skeptical of a woman, especially a wealthy foreign woman, telling them how to fight. They are split into rival political factions: communists who want a violent social revolution, nationalists who want a restoration of the old republic, and bandits who are simply using the chaos of war to settle old scores. They do not want a leader. They want guns, money, and ammunition. Imagine the absolute psychological isolation of her position during these first few weeks in the wilderness. You are sitting beside her in a drafty, damp stone hut high in the hills, lit only by a single sputtering tallow candle. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap wood smoke, and the bitter tang of chicory coffee. Around the table sit a dozen hardened men, their hands resting on stolen rifles, their eyes boring into her with a mixture of resentment and curiosity. They do not see her achievements in Marseille. They see a potential liability, a soft socialite who doesn't belong in their brutal world of mud and blood. Nancy knows that if she shows even a flicker of hesitation, if her voice trembles for a fraction of a second, or if she pulls rank using her British commission, they will ignore her, take her money, and leave her to freeze in the woods. She chooses a different strategy. She outcalculates, outdrinks, outmarches, and outswears them. She refuses the comfort of a bed, sleeping on the cold ground wrapped in a single wool blanket, just like the lowest private. She carries her own heavy rucksack, refusing to let any man help her with her gear as they trek for 20 miles across the steep volcanic ridges. When they sit down at night to drink the harsh, throat-burning moonshine distilled from wild plums, she doesn't sip politely. She matches them, drink for drink, slam for slam, maintaining her absolute dignity while laughing at their crudest jokes. She proves to them that she is not a delicate flower sent by politicians in London, but a predatory animal that has crawled out of the same jungle they inhabit. Her real power, however, lies in her absolute control over the sky. She is the only link between these starving partisans and the massive arsenals of Great Britain. You are standing with her on a clearing atop a high plateau at 3 o'clock in the morning, the cold mud soaking through your boots. The night is silent until Nancy nods to her wireless operator. Suddenly, the low, distant thrum of heavy British bombers vibrates through the air. Nancy steps forward and flashes a secret code with her torch into the darkness of the sky. A minute later, the sky seems to rain steel and silk. Hundreds of heavy containers drift down, packed to the brim with modern plastic explosives, Sten guns, ammunition, medical supplies, and crisp millions of French francs. The Maquis watch in absolute awe as this woman conjures an army's worth of weapons out of thin air. From that moment on, she is no longer an outsider to be tolerated. She is a goddess of war to be obeyed without question. Yet, this absolute authority comes at a devastating psychological cost. The higher you climb into the hierarchy of power, the more you are cut off from the warmth. The loneliness of her position is compounded by an agonizing, perpetual silence from the outside world. She has heard absolutely nothing from her husband, Henri, since she fled Marseille more than a year ago. Every time she closes her eyes in the freezing darkness of her mountain tent, his face appears in her mind. Is he safe? Is he still managing his factories? Does he think she is dead? She cannot send a letter, she cannot make a phone call, and she cannot ask her wireless operators to search for him because any transmission could be intercepted by the Gestapo, leading them directly to his door. She has to lock that love away in the darkest, most private chamber of her heart, freezing her emotions so that she can focus on the daily, clinical business of killing the enemy. The war in the Auvergne is not a chivalrous affair. It is an industrial slaughter conducted in the shadows. The German forces in the region, including the infamous 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, are frustrated by the constant disruption of their supply lines as they try to march north to reinforce the beaches of Normandy. They unleash a campaign of unspeakable medieval savagery against the local population. They do not just hunt the Maquis, they burn entire villages to the ground, hang civilians from lampposts, and torture anyone suspected of carrying food to the hills. You can feel the suffocating weight of this responsibility pressing down on Nancy's shoulders. The people of the Auvergne are dying because she is doing her job too well. The more successful her sabotage operations, the more brutal the German retaliation. She is forced to witness the smoke rising from burning farmhouses in the valleys below, knowing that families are being wiped out because they gave her men a loaf of bread. A lesser mind would be crushed by the guilt. But Nancy hardens her heart into flint. She understands that the only way to end the nightmare is to accelerate the destruction of the occupiers. Pity is a luxury she cannot afford. Only victory matters. The true test of her isolation and her terrifying psychological endurance arrives in June 1944. The Gestapo, determined to locate the central command post of the Auvergne Resistance deploys a specialized direction-finding vehicle to track the radio signals of Nancy's team during a massive, coordinated German assault on their mountain stronghold at Montmouchet. The resistance fighters are forced to scatter into the woods under a relentless barrage of artillery and mortar fire. In the chaotic retreat, the team's wireless radio is smashed to pieces and their operator is killed. This is an absolute catastrophe. Without a radio, Nancy is completely blind and completely mute. She cannot request ammunition. She cannot coordinate with the approaching Allied armies, and she cannot warn London about German troop movements. The nearest backup radio is located in the town of Châteauroux, more than 130 miles away, through territory thick with German patrols, roadblocks, and treacherous terrain. There are no vehicles available, no fuel, and no men who can be spared from the front line to make the journey. Nancy looks around at her demoralized, exhausted officers who are ready to give up and scatter into the mountains to save themselves. She realizes that if the network collapses now, months of work will be erased, and thousands of men will die in vain. She stands up, fastens her pistol belt, pulls her trench coat tightly around her, and announces that she will go herself. She will ride a heavy, single-speed bicycle across the mountainous, enemy-occupied heart of France to retrieve the codes and find a working radio. You are cycling beside her now through the freezing, pitch-black night of June 1944, and the sheer, physical madness of the task begins to settle into your bones. The road ahead is a ribbon of endless, agonizing hills that burn your thighs with every revolution of the pedals. The rain shifts from a miserable drizzle to a stinging, torrential downpour that blurs your vision and turns the dirt roads into treacherous mires of mud. Nancy has been awake for over 36 hours. Her body is bruised from the recent battle. Her hands are raw from holding the rough rubber grips of the handlebars, and her feet are blistering inside her leather shoes. Every shadow along the tree line looks like a German sniper. Every bend in the road could conceal an SS checkpoint. If she is stopped, she has no papers that can survive a rigorous inspection, and she is carrying document fragments that would mean immediate torture and execution. She cannot use a light. She must navigate by the faint, silver glow of the moon, filtering through the storm clouds, steering her bicycle around massive potholes and debris by sheer instinct. When the sun rises, the danger triples. The roads are no longer empty. They are filled with convoys of armored cars, trucks filled with singing German soldiers, and low-flying enemy fighter planes that strafe anything moving on the highways. She is forced to dive into ditches, flattening her body against the wet earth, holding her breath as the heavy tanks rumble past just feet from her head, the smell of diesel fuel and hot metal washing over her. She does not stop to eat. She does not stop to rest. When the fatigue becomes an overwhelming, physical weight that threatens to pull her into unconsciousness, she thinks of the old men in Vienna cleaning the pavement with lye. She thinks of Henri's gentle smile in Marseille. She transforms her physical pain into a cold, driving engine of pure, unadulterated hatred. She refuses to let her body break. After 29 hours of continuous, grueling physical exertion, she rolls into Châteauroux, her clothes soaked with sweat and rain, her face caked with mud, her legs trembling so violently she can barely stand. She finds the secret SOE operator, hidden in a back-alley apartment, transmits her vital intelligence to London, coordinates a massive ammunition drop for her stranded men, and climbs back onto her bicycle to ride all the way back to her unit. When she finally returns to the camp, having traveled over 260 miles in 3 days, through the jaws of the enemy war machine, she collapses onto the ground, unable to speak, her knees swollen to twice their normal size. The rough, hardened Maquis fighters look down at her, and for the first time, there is no sarcasm, no doubt, and no hesitation in their eyes. They look at her with an expression that borders on religious reverence. They realize that this woman is not human. She is a force of nature that cannot be stopped by mountains, armies, or the fear of death itself. She has conquered her isolation by becoming the very soul of their resistance. You are standing in the courtyard of a captured German administrative building in the late summer of 1944. The EU air is thick with the sweet, sickening smell of burning paper. Everywhere you look, black flakes of charred documents drift upward into the bright blue sky like a reverse snowfall. The mighty machine that once held Europe in an iron grip is fracturing, splitting at the seams as the Allied armies push inland from the Normandy beaches, and the Soviet juggernaut thunders from the east. In the Auvergne, Nancy Wake's guerrilla army has turned the retreat into a bloody gauntlet. The Maquis are no longer just hiding in the woods. They have descended from the mountains like a pack of wolves, tearing at the flanks of the withdrawing German divisions, blowing up bridges, ambushing supply trucks, and reclaiming towns hour by hour. But do not mistake the chaos of an empire's collapse for an easy victory. This is, in many ways, the most dangerous phase of the entire conflict. A cornered predator is at its most lethal, and the retreating German forces, particularly the fanatical units of the SS, are executing a scorched earth policy. They are angry, humiliated, and desperate. They turn their weapons on anyone and anything left behind. Imagine the psychological landscape Nancy must navigate as the old order shatters. You are walking beside her through the streets of a newly liberated village. The townspeople are out in the squares, waving improvised flags, weeping, and singing the Marseillaise. It feels like a moment of pure triumph. But when you look closely at Nancy, you see no joy in her eyes. She knows that the collapse of German authority has created a terrifying power vacuum. The fragile alliance she maintained between the communist partisans, the nationalists, and the local bandits is beginning to splinter. Now that the common enemy is fleeing, these factions are turning their weapons on each other, maneuvering for political control of the post-war ruins. The violence has shifted from tactical military operations to a dark, personal purge. In every town the Maquis liberate, they round up suspected collaborators, black marketeers, and women who were accused of sleeping with German soldiers. Nancy has to witness the raw, ugly reality of human vengeance. She watches as young women have their heads brutally shaved in public squares, while crowds jeer and spit on them. She watches as men are dragged behind buildings and shot without a trial, their bodies left in the dirt with cardboard signs pinned to their chests. This is the fracture she dreaded. She has spent months forging these men into a disciplined fighting force, but the moment the pressure of the occupation lifts, the thin veneer of civilization vanishes, revealing a primal, chaotic desire for retribution. She is forced to step into this moral gray area, using her immense authority and the cold threat of her own pistol to maintain some semblance of order, preventing her army of liberation from degenerating into a lawless mob. Yet, the most brutal blow Nancy will face during this period of collapse does not come from a rogue partisan or a desperate firefight. It comes in the form of a quiet confession in a liberated city. As the Gestapo evacuated their headquarters in Marseille, fleeing northward ahead of the advancing Allied forces, they left behind a trail of devastated lives and empty cells. For over a year, Nancy had maintained a fragile, defensive wall around her heart, telling herself that her husband Henri was safe, that his wealth and high social standing would protect him from the worst of the regime's cruelty. She believed that once the war was over, she would return to their luxury apartment overlooking the Mediterranean, slide back into her silk dresses, and drink champagne on the balcony with the man she loved. The illusion shatters on a warm afternoon when she meets an intelligence officer who had been investigating the local Gestapo files. You are sitting in the room as the officer sits down across from Nancy, his head bowed, unable to look her in the eye. He pushes a thin manila folder across the desk. Her fingers tremble slightly as she opens it. The report details the arrest of Henri Fiocca in October 1943. Only months after Nancy had fled the city, the secret police had realized he was financing the escape network. But more importantly, they knew he was the husband of the White Mouse. They had thrown him into a windowless isolation cell, subjecting him to months of systematic clinical torture. They wanted a name. They wanted an address. They wanted a code. They wanted to know where his wife was hiding. Henri, the gentle, cultured businessman who had never held a weapon in his life, refused to speak a single word. He did not give them a name. He did not give them a path to find her. For months, he endured the unimaginable horrors of the Gestapo basements, protecting the woman he adored with a silent, iron fortitude that rivaled any soldier on the battlefield. When the torturers finally realized they could not break his spirit, they marched him into the courtyard and executed him by firing squad. When Nancy finishes reading the report, she does not cry. She does not scream. She sits perfectly still, her face turning into an absolute mask of stone. The psychological armor she had worn to survive the war has clamped shut, locking the immense grief and guilt inside where no one can see it. She realizes that her success as the White Mouse, the 5 million franc bounty, the legendary escapes, the brilliant sabotage missions, had cost the life of the only person who truly understood her. Her husband had died in the dark, tortured because she was too famous to catch. The empire has fractured, and the war is drawing to its inevitable, bloody conclusion. But for Nancy Wake, the victory is already hollow. The liberation of France, a moment she had dreamed of on the cold mountain plateaus, has arrived dressed in mourning clothes. As she closes the folder and steps out into the bright afternoon sun, surrounded by the cheering crowds of a free nation, she has never been more completely, devastatingly alone. You are sitting in the grand, high-ceilinged ballroom of a government ministry in Paris in the summer of 1945. The war in Europe is officially over. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast a brilliant, fracturing light across a sea of immaculate military uniforms, glittering medals, and sleek evening gowns. At the front of the room, high-ranking generals and politicians speak in booming, theatrical tones about courage, eternal glory, and the sacred soul of the resistance. They are handing out heavy bronze crosses and colorful silk ribbons. When Nancy Wake's name is called, she steps forward into the applause. The George Medal from the United Kingdom, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, the Médaille de la Résistance, and no less than 3 Croix de Guerre from France. She is decorated more heavily than almost any other woman in the conflict. To the photographers snapping pictures and the journalists scribbling notes, she is a living legend, a cinematic heroine who stepped out of the shadows to save a nation. But if you look closely at her eyes as the heavy metals are pinned to her lapel, you see a profound, unbridgeable distance. The applause in the ballroom sounds flat, echoing hollowly against the walls. For Nancy, the official myths of the post-war world do not align with the reality she carries in her memory. The politicians want a clean, inspiring story of good triumphing over evil to help rebuild a broken national identity. They do not want to talk about the mud, the raw smell of cordite, the throat cutting in the dark, or the bodies of young men left to rot in volcanic ditches. They certainly do not want to talk about the devastating personal cost paid by those who actually held the line. The transition from a legendary guerrilla commander back to a regular civilian is a slow, agonizing psychological bend. Imagine the sheer friction of trying to fit a personality forged in absolute, high-stakes survival back into the narrow, polite confines of peacetime society. You are sitting across from her at a cafe table in London a year after the war. She is dressed in a beautiful dress. Her lipstick is perfect, but her eyes never stop scanning the room. Every time a door slams too loudly, her muscles instantly tense. When people ask her about her wartime exploits, seeking romantic stories of espionage and adventure, she finds herself met with a profound, isolating misunderstanding. They want to hear about a glamorous white mouse playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. They cannot comprehend the cold, clinical reality of a commander who had to authorize executions and watch her husband's world burn. She tries to return to a semblance of normal life, but the old world no longer exists for her. She works for the British Air Ministry in the intelligence department, but the bureaucratic infighting and desk-bound routine feel like a slow death compared to the raw clarity of the mountains. She returns to Australia in the late 1940s, attempting to enter politics, running for a seat in Parliament. She wants to continue fighting for the principles of liberty and anti-totalitarianism that she bled for in Europe. But the political arena of peacetime Australia is petty, cynical, and filled with men who view her wartime record not with respect, but with a quiet, sexist suspicion. They see an outspoken, aggressive woman who drinks gin with the boys and refuses to play the part of a traditional, quiet housewife. She loses the elections by razor-thin margins, frustrated by the short memories of a public that has already forgotten the lessons of the previous decade. The myth of the white mouse begins to take on a life of its own, independent of the flesh and blood woman who earned it. Books are written about her, movies are proposed, and television documentaries begin to catalog her exploits. Yet, Nancy grows increasingly hostile toward the way her story is commercialized and sanitized. She refuses to let her life be turned into a cheap Hollywood romance. When a major film production attempts to rewrite her story to include a fictional, dramatic love affair with a British officer during her time in the Maquis, she threatens to sue them into bankruptcy. She protects the memory of Henri Fiocca with a fierce, protective loyalty that borders on religious devotion. She knows that the world wants to remember her victories, but she wants them to remember his sacrifice. The quiet man who died in a Gestapo basement so that she could remain a legend. As the decades march on, the world changes around her. The Cold War redefines global politics, old empires dissolve, and the mid-century trauma fades into the pages of history textbooks. For Nancy, the echoes of that era never truly fade. She eventually returns to England, choosing to spend her later years living at the Stafford Hotel in London, drinking her daily gin and tonic in the American bar, surrounded by artifacts of a world that understood the price of freedom. She becomes a fixture there, a sharp-witted, elegant older woman who can still outdrink men half her age and freeze a pretentious conversationalist with a single icy glare. She chooses to live in a hotel because it offers a transient, unattached existence that mirrors the freedom she fought for. She does not want to be anchored by possessions or domestic routines. She remains, until the very end, a soldier of fortune who belongs only to herself. The empire she helped destroy has become a distant historical chapter, and the men she commanded in the mountains have slipped one by one into the earth. She is left behind as one of the final guardians of a brutal truth. The medals she was awarded sit in a drawer, occasionally dusted off for official anniversaries, but she views them with a philosophical detachment. She knows that the true legacy of her survival is not measured in bronze or silver, but in the quiet, ordinary lives of the people who walked out of those escape networks, and the freedom of a continent that forgot what it was like to listen for jackboots in the dark. You are sitting by a tall, arched window in the quiet library of a London sanctuary as the final hours of a long, rain-swept Sunday fade into a deep, velvety twilight. The year is 2011. Outside, the modern world moves at a frantic, digitized pace, a world of glowing smartphone screens, glass skyscrapers, and endless, rushing traffic that has long forgotten the sharp, mechanical thud of military boots on damp cobblestones. But inside this room, the air is still, smelling faintly of old paper, polished mahogany, and the gentle, fading warmth of a dying hearth. In an armchair near the window sits Nancy Wake. She is 98 years old now. Her hair is a soft, striking silver. Her hands are lined with the deep tracks of time, but when she turns her head to look at you, her eyes still possess that same cold, piercing clarity that once made a Gestapo colonel blink with uncomfortably sudden doubt. The long day is drawing to its close, and with it, the final act of a life that was lived with an almost terrifying intensity. For decades, Nancy has carried the heavy, unseen architecture of a vanished era within her mind. She has survived the trenches of the Underground War, the brutal purges of the Liberation, the cold indifference of peacetime politics, and the slow, isolating march of old age that gradually robs a warrior of her comrades. One by one, the characters who populated her grand, dangerous drama have slipped into the shadows of the past. Henri Tardiva, the rugged partisan who teased her about the beautiful fruit on the trees of France, is gone. The wireless operators who tapped out life and death codes from frozen mountain shacks are silent. The British officers who marveled at her endurance in the corridors of Whitehall have been laid to rest beneath neat stone markers. She is the last sentinel standing on a battlefield that has returned to peaceful meadowland. Imagine the immense philosophical weight of this final, quiet isolation. You are leaning closer as she takes a slow, deliberate sip from her glass. Not the medicine or the herbal teas prescribed for a fragile centenarian, but her customary gin and tonic, ice clinking softly against the glass like a tiny domestic bell. She has never allowed the world to domesticate her, nor has she ever permitted old age to dilute the fierce, uncompromising essence of who she was. When doctors told her to cut back on the alcohol and live a quiet, predictable life, she laughed, told them she had survived the SS and had no intention of being defeated by a medical chart, and ordered another drink. She has lived her life entirely on her own terms, a free agent who refused to apologize for her strength, her anger, or her vices. As the shadows lengthen across the library floor, stretching into the dark corners like the lanes of occupied Paris, she mapped so meticulously 70 years ago, the conversation turns toward the nature of memory and legacy. The world has built monuments to her name. Governments have written her into history books as a flawless, romantic heroine, the elegant white mouse who played a high-stakes game of intrigue and adventure. But Nancy has no use for the sanitized, polished versions of history that people use to comfort themselves. She knows that the true story of war is not a series of glorious sweeping gestures. It is an accumulation of gritty, exhausting, and often horrific details. It is the raw smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies in a mountain cave, the sudden, sickening crash of a railway line blowing up in the dark, the cold, heavy weight of a Colt .45 pistol against the hip, and the absolute, clinical necessity of shooting an informant through the back of the head before he can give up the location of 100 men. She looks out the window, watching the rain streak the glass, her thoughts drifting back to the rugged, volcanic peaks of the Auvergne. She doesn't think about the medals sitting in their plush velvet boxes in a drawer upstairs. Medals she eventually sold because she believed they would just be collected by someone who didn't understand the blood it took to earn them. Instead, she thinks about the small human moments that never made it into the official dispatches. She remembers the young, terrified French boys who came to her camps in the woods, their shoes held together with string, their bellies empty, looking at her with a desperate, heartbreaking faith that she could somehow keep them alive. She remembers the crushing guilt of knowing that some of them died carrying out her orders, their young lives cut short to delay a German supply train for just 12 hours, and, as she always does when the room grows dark and the world settles into silence, she thinks of Henri Fiocca. The grief of his loss has not changed over the decades. It has simply settled deep into the foundation of her soul, a permanent, quiet ache that time could never heal. For over 60 years, she has lived with the devastating knowledge that her fame was his execution warrant. Every honor she received from the Allies was paid for with the currency of his suffering in that windowless Marseille basement. She has never forgiven the world for that trade. Yet, as the final slumber approaches, that blinding fury that drove her across the Pyrenees and through the German lines has finally begun to cool, replaced by a deep, philosophical acceptance. She realizes that Henri's sacrifice was not a tragedy of wasted devotion, but an act of supreme, historical defiance. He chose to die in the dark so that she could live to lead an army into the light. His silence was his own weapon of war, an impenetrable wall that the Gestapo could never break. The night has fully arrived now, wrapping the room in a safe, velvet darkness. The rain outside has softened to a gentle, hypnotic patter against the window pane, a soothing soundtrack that invites the mind to let go of its heavy defenses. Nancy leans her head back against the cushioned chair, her breathing slowing to a steady, peaceful rhythm. The tension that has held her jaw tight since 1933, the hyper-vigilant, defensive armor of an operative who could never afford to sleep soundly, finally begins to dissolve. She doesn't need to listen for the distant wail of a train whistle anymore. She doesn't need to scan the shadows for the flash of a silver badge or the silhouette of a watcher. The war is over. The empire has fallen. The debts have all been paid in full. You watch as her fingers gently loosen their grip around the glass, her hands resting quietly in her lap, like those of a traveler who has finally reached the end of an incredibly long, exhausting journey. She is shifting away from the world of dates, battles, and historical registries, stepping back into the vast, timeless quiet from which she emerged. She leaves behind a world that is freer, kinder, and infinitely brighter, because she chose to stand in the breach when the darkness was at its absolute zenith. The story of the White Mouse does not end with a grand explosion or a dramatic declaration, but here, in the soft, warm stillness of a midnight room, where the memories of the mountains fade into the gentle, secure embrace of a deep, well-earned sleep. The room is quiet now. The fire has burned down to a soft, glowing ember, casting a faint, protective light over the warrior at rest. You can close the book. You can let the silence settle. You can breathe out, knowing that the night is safe, the watch is over, and the phantom of the resistance has finally found her peace.